What really happened at Dyatlov Pass? They were 9 young, incredibly seasoned hikers from Russia. Students and engineers, all of them trained to survive in the harshest conditions you can imagine. So why, on the night of February 1, 1959, did they slash their tent open from the inside and run, half-dressed, into a blizzard with hurricane-force winds? When investigators found them, they were scattered across a desolate mountainside. Some had bizarre, crushing injuries. Others were missing body parts. And their clothes had strange traces of radiation. The official story points to an avalanche, but the evidence tells a much different story, a story of unnatural terror and a force that science just can't explain. What really happened on the Mountain of the Dead wasn't a natural disaster. It was an encounter. On January 27, 1959, 10 students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, set off on a trek that would be the ultimate test of their skills. Their plan was to travel nearly 190 miles through the northern Ural Mountains, with the goal of reaching Mount Oteton before heading to their final destination, the village of Vizhay. This was a Grade 3 expedition, the highest difficulty rating, meant only for the most experienced winter adventurers. One of them, Yuri Yudin, had to turn back early because of an illness. It was a twist of fate that almost certainly saved his life. The other 9 pushed on. Thanks to the photos and journal entries they left behind, we can piece together their last days. They were a tight-knit group, full of life, smiling and supporting each other as they moved through the brutal landscape. But on February 1st, the weather got worse. Facing heavy snow and powerful winds, they made a puzzling choice. They veered off their planned route and set up camp on the exposed slope of a mountain the local Mansi people call Kolat Sayatl, which means Dead Mountain. This would be their last camp. The final photo recovered from their camera shows them digging into the snow, trying to shelter their tent from the wind. Inside, they prepared a meal. Sliced food was still on a plate when the tent was found. Their diaries mentioned challenges, but there was no sense of dread, no fear. Everything seemed normal. And then, sometime after that last meal, something went horribly, terrifyingly wrong. An unknown event triggered a flight of pure, primal terror. The kind of terror that makes 9 experienced survivalists abandon all their training, all their gear, and their only shelter to face a frozen hell. When the group didn't send their scheduled telegram on February 12th, no one panicked. Delays happen. But as days bled into weeks, a search party was launched. On February 26th, they found the campsite. Or what was left of it. The tent was collapsed and buried in snow. And it had been slashed open from the inside. All of the group's belongings, boots, warm coats, food, axes, were still there. A single line of footprints led away from the tent, heading down the slope towards a dense forest over a mile away. Some prints were from boots, others just socks. Some were completely barefoot. It was there, under a massive cedar tree, that searchers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. They were stripped down to their underwear. This can be a sign of paradoxical undressing, a strange phenomenon where people freezing to death suddenly feel hot and remove their clothes, but it didn't explain the scene. Their hands were raw and burned, and the branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to 15 feet high, suggesting one of them had desperately climbed it. Were they trying to see the tent? Or were they trying to escape something on the ground? Between that tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were found, including the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was frozen, clutching a tree branch, his eyes fixed in the direction of the camp he'd fled. Their positions suggested they were trying to crawl back to the very shelter they had so violently escaped. The cause of death for these first 5 hikers was ruled as hypothermia. They froze to death. But that still left 4 hikers missing. And what could have possibly made them freeze, when all their warm gear was just a short, desperate crawl away? It took 2 more months for the spring thaw to reveal the answer. The last 4 were found in a ravine, buried under 13 feet of snow. And it was with these 4 that the mystery of Dyatlov Pass went from a tragic accident to something much, much stranger. The final 4 hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolvatov, died from something else entirely. Nikolai had a massive skull fracture. Lyudmila and Semyon had suffered catastrophic chest injuries with numerous broken ribs. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozroshdeny, said the force needed to cause such damage was like being hit by a car. But here's the part that makes no sense: these devastating internal injuries had almost no major external wounds. It was as if they'd been squeezed by some immense, invisible pressure that crushed their bones without tearing their skin. Dr. Vozroshdeny stated firmly that another human could not have done this. The force was too great, and there were no signs of a struggle. The horror didn't stop there. Lyudmila Dubinina was found missing her tongue, eyes and parts of her lips. Semyon Zolotaryov was also missing his eyeballs. The official report later suggested this was just natural decay from being in a stream, maybe some scavenging animals. But for many, that explanation has always felt too neat, too simple to explain the strangely precise nature of the missing tissue. And then there was the radiation. Forensic tests found that some of the hikers' clothing, especially on the bodies in the ravine, had traces of radioactive contamination. The levels weren't high enough to be lethal, but they were significant enough to be noted in the final report. So, what are we left with? A sliced tent, a panicked flight into a blizzard, crushing internal injuries, missing body parts, and radiation. What on earth happened on that mountain? Faced with this mountain of bizarre evidence, the Soviet investigation was surprisingly brief and secretive. After just 3 months, the case was closed. The official conclusion was that the hikers died from a compelling natural force. For decades, everyone assumed that meant an avalanche. In fact, in 2020, Russia officially adopted the avalanche theory, and a 2021 study even used computer models to argue that a specific type of slab avalanche could have been the trigger. But this theory is just riddled with holes. The hikers were far too experienced to camp in an avalanche-prone area. The slope above their tent just wasn't that steep. More importantly, the first rescuers on the scene reported no signs of an avalanche, no debris field, none of the telltale snow patterns. And then there are the footprints, which left the tent in an orderly line, not the chaotic scramble of people running from a wall of snow. And an avalanche simply doesn't explain the most disturbing evidence. It doesn't explain the massive internal injuries with minimal external damage. It doesn't explain why Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue. And it certainly doesn't explain the radiation. The avalanche theory feels less like an answer and more like a convenient label slapped on something the authorities couldn't, or wouldn't, explain. The official story just doesn't seem to fit the facts. So what does? To answer that, we might have to look beyond the natural world. When logical explanations come up short, we're forced to consider the illogical. The theories about what really happened at Dyatlov Pass aren't just wild guesses, they're attempts to find a story that fits all the evidence, no matter how strange it gets. One of the most popular theories involves secret Soviet weapons testing. The late 1950s were the peak of the Cold War, and the Ural Mountains were a hub of military activity. Did the hikers stumble onto something they weren't supposed to see? This idea is supported by another group of hikers who, about 30 miles south of the incident, reported seeing strange, glowing orange spheres in the northern sky on the exact same night. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, later claimed he was ordered by high-level officials to shut the case down and dismiss those sightings, and that he personally believed the flying spheres killed the hikers. The radiation found on the clothing would certainly fit with some kind of radiological weapon. Another chilling theory points to something even further outside our reality, a UFO encounter. Those orange spheres might have been more than just a weapons test. One of the last photos from the hiker's camera seems to show a bright, blurry object in the sky, though skeptics say it could just be a camera flaw. Could the crushing force that killed the final four have been some kind of advanced technology? It sounds like science fiction, but it fits the bizarre medical evidence better than any avalanche. Finally, we have to look at the folklore of the mountain itself. The name Kolat-Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, was given by the indigenous Mansi people for a reason. They have legends of vengeful spirits and even a Russian yeti or menk. Early theories of a Mansi attack were quickly dismissed, there were no other footprints, and the Mansi were peaceful. But what if the hikers disturbed something else? Something ancient, territorial, and powerful. A force that could cause such profound terror that it drove them into the storm, a force capable of inflicting the brutal injuries they suffered. Could that be the compelling natural force the official report mentioned? Not natural to our science, but natural to the mountain itself. For over 60 years, the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident has haunted us. We have the diaries, the photos, the medical reports, and yet, we are no closer to a real answer. New studies claim to have solved it with avalanches, but they tend to ignore the most unsettling pieces of the puzzle. The truth is, no single theory perfectly explains everything. An avalanche doesn't account for the radiation or the strange injuries. A military test doesn't quite explain the missing tongue or why the survivors took clothes from their dead friends. We're left with a collection of impossible facts. 9 experienced hikers fled their only shelter into a blizzard. They died from the cold, from a crushing force, and maybe from sheer terror. Their bodies tell a story of a final, horrifying ordeal. Perhaps the real answer is a mix of these theories, or maybe it's something we don't even have a name for yet. What we do know is that on that frozen mountainside, 9 people faced a terror so overwhelming it defied all logic. The real mystery isn't just what they died from. It's what they were running from.